Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining this afternoon's webinar presented by NASEO's Rural Energy Task Force. I'm very excited to have this panel together to talk about new revenue streams and options about environmental markets to support the agricultural community. We'll get started in another minute or so, let people log in, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, well, we're a couple minutes after the hour and we have a lot to get to, so let's get started. I'm Dylan Tucker. I'm a senior program manager with NASEO and I run our Rural Energy Task Force. Thanks to everybody for joining. The task force explores different ways that state energy offices are supporting agriculture communities, rural residents, and how we can support economic development, energy development in those areas. So we're excited to have the current panel today. I'm going to pass things over to Julie Staveland shortly, who's the Sustainability Section Manager at the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. But before I do that, I just want to cover some quick logistics. We'll go through the webinar, each speaker. We have 3 great speakers lined up, and then we have time set aside for Q&A after. So you can type questions throughout through the Q&A feature or just chat them to me. Otherwise, there's also a raise hand feature. So when we get to Q&A, you can raise your hand and you can unmute yourself, or I'll unmute you and you ask the question directly to the panelist. So we'll go ahead and get things started. I'll pass things to Julie, and yeah, thanks everybody for joining.
Awesome, thanks Dylan. Good afternoon everyone. As Dylan said, my name is Julie Staveland and I'm the manager of the Sustainability Section within the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, also known as EGLE. And one of the areas I help oversee is Energy Services, which is the designated state energy office for Michigan. And we provide a wide range of energy programs, primarily working with communities and businesses on energy management projects to help them achieve their energy goals. So one of our programs is the Agricultural and Rural Businesses Program, and that was developed based off of the findings that we had from the Agricultural and Rural Communities Energy Roadmap that was completed in 2019. Another one of our key programs is the Community Energy Management Program, and that provides funding directly to rural and urban communities to meet them wherever they're at on the energy management spectrum. And then through this program, we've developed the Clean Energy and Energy Management webinar series, and this breaks energy management down into bite-sized pieces that can be consumed in a 1-hour webinar. These webinars are recorded and free to attend, and we post them on our website in addition to the slides. And they're designed to provide general information and a broad overview, as well as detailed information for specific topics, such as energy audits, benchmarking, energy project financing. And then usually after that presentation is followed by an example from a rural and an urban community from Michigan. And they share their story of how they implemented a project and how it impacted their community. And this is in an effort to foster peer-to-peer learning within our Michigan communities. We're also providing technical assistance to communities on incorporating renewable energy into their planning and zoning ordinances, and renewable energy on farmland is often a frequent question that we get. So Governor Whitmer's commitment to carbon neutrality by 2050 is going to require offsets and looking at the impact of every sector, which brings us to today's discussion. I'm excited to introduce today's panelists who are working on these issues from several angles. Our first presenter is Dr. Nichole Fitzgerald, Program Manager of the Bioenergy Technologies Office in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy for the U.S. Department of Energy. Nichole is passionate about finding ways to get renewable carbon into the materials we use daily and has pioneered several bioproduct and functional replacement initiatives for the Bioenergy Technologies Office. And as the program manager for the Advanced Algal Systems and Feedstock Technologies Program, Nichole oversees $80 million in annual appropriations aimed at advancing the state of technology for algal biofuels production and feedstock supply and logistics. Nichole?
Thank you so much, Julie. Can Can everybody see my screen?
Now I can, yeah.
Yes, excellent. Okay. Well, so thank you. Again, as Julie said, I'm Nichole Fitzgerald, and I am a program manager at the U.S. Department of Energy Bioenergy Technologies Office, and we refer to that as BETO. I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to talk to you about our nascent efforts in the area of supporting farmers through environmental revenue streams. So the first thing I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about what we do at our office and explain why reducing the carbon intensity of agriculture practices is so important to us. And then I'll tell you a bit about what we've done so far, and then also let you know a little bit about future opportunities that we anticipate in this space. So let's see, there we go. So at BETO, we see great potential in building the bioeconomy. Some of those benefits are listed here on this slide. The vision for our office is a thriving and sustainable bioeconomy fueled by innovative technologies. And the way that we hope to achieve our vision is to develop the technologies underpinning a thriving bioeconomy. So our office is a program office, meaning that we fund R&D, so we do not develop policy, although our research and our analysis efforts are often used to inform policy made by our sister offices across the federal government. So as an example, something that we're tackling right now is how can the U.S. start sourcing 100% of our aviation fuel from biomass resources? So to do this, we would ask, what are the research needs to make this happen? How do you get a biomass feedstock into a convertible form that a chemical engineer could then use to make into a fuel or chemical? How do you ensure that the feedstocks that were produced were done in a sustainable fashion? So as we ask these questions, we set strategic goals around our R&D that is funded by BETO. So in order to achieve our strategic goals, we're organized in our office across the supply chain. So we have smaller groups focusing on more tractable goals. So we have a feedstocks technologies program, and that really focuses on lowering the cost and improving the quality of renewable carbon feedstocks. These feedstocks that we consider can include agricultural waste like corn stover or forest residues, or energy crops or waste like sludge or municipal solid waste, or even CO2. The only feedstock that this team does not tackle is algae, and that's because algae poses such a unique challenge. So we have an entire algae program that works on that. But today's topic really fits on our feedstock technologies program, so that's where I'm going to focus. The goal of this program is to develop the technologies to transform renewable carbon sources into high quality, sustainable, conversion ready, and energy dense feedstocks. And some of the approaches we take include identifying the key feedstock quality and performance attributes that affect biorefineries, improving the efficiency of feedstock logistic operations. So the focus of today's webinar is on revenue streams for farmers. Our office has lots of experience in working with agricultural practitioners to develop the supply chain and logistics for harvesting agricultural waste and selling it to biofuels producers. Companies like Poet and Archer Daniel Midlands already use these resources in the production of cellulosic ethanol and other products. And so as we consider growing the bioeconomy, bringing energy crops online like switchgrass and miscanthus, that's going to be imperative to making that a reality. As we have explored some mechanisms for making energy crops a potential revenue stream for farm communities. And finally, an emerging market involves quality soil carbon, quantifying soil carbon sequestration and other ecosystem services and selling those as credits towards carbon removal strategies. So we refer to this as carbon banking, but there's many terms for it. And we know that this is going to be important because so many companies are making commitments to invest in carbon removal strategies. While our office historically has played in the fuel space, there's clearly more potential here for revenue generation. Soil carbon sequestration is going to be a major revenue stream. And frankly, we feel that the agricultural community that implements some of these practices should receive a piece of that pie. So what are the types of practices that enhance soil carbon and hopefully can be quantified and lead to revenue streams? So apologies for this very ugly slide, but this is just a quick list taken from the Carbon 180 report on scaling carbon storage in agriculture. These practices include minimizing soil disturbance through reduced tillage, planting perennial crops, and employing cover crop strategies. Obviously, these practices are not applicable in every situation, but this is just a quick list of tangible carbon management strategies that could be deployed. So I guess one of my major points here is that regardless of if your end goal is atmospheric carbon removal or making biofuels less carbon intensive, we need to address the emission contributions of feedstock production. So us who are playing in the biofuel space, this is how we look at it. About 40% of emissions from biofuels are associated with fertilizer and feedstock production. When we think about how to address this, we often use averages instead of field level specific data. So when we start to think about how would a carbon market or incentive system work in terms of getting credit for practices that reduce emissions, we need to have field level data that accurately captures what's going on that particular field. So currently, we feel like we do not have the tools that we need to measure carbon intensity or feedstock production at a field level. When we consider reducing carbon intensity of feedstock production at a field level, DOE has been pursuing two major approaches. One is how to best implement those soil carbon management practices, and the other is how to quantify those. So my office, Bioenergy Technologies office, has taken the analyze and implement approach. We have funded research that helps establish practices for addressing environmental sustainability. And then my colleagues at our sister office, RPE, have focused on measuring and quantifying. So they recently launched the Smart Farm program that aims at developing tools for reliable, accurate, and cost-effective quantification of carbon intensity at the field level. And I'll talk about that more in a second. So diving into just a little bit into the type of work that my office funds, we recently had a few FOAs, or funding opportunity announcements, that were aimed at establishing best practices and improving environmental sustainability metrics. These projects that we funded were sized about between $3 and $9 million. And the ones that are complete have developed strategies for growing energy crops on marginal land and restoring water quality and soil health. For the Smart Farm program that my colleagues at RPE have developed, the program vision is to make it possible and profitable to optimize for yield and carbon intensity. They are focusing on emissions drivers like N2O and net negative emission strategies like soil carbon sequestration. So the Smart Farm program has two types of projects. The first type is aims to capture high resolution soil data and make that data available to the public. And so that's kind of what is shown on this graphic. And then the second type of projects are teams that are developing commercial tools to directly measure nitrogen and carbon flux. So for example, one of the awardees is a company called Yardstick, where they're developing a handheld probe that incorporates machine learning to measure and calculate carbon in the soil. University of Utah is another awardee. They're taking a different approach where they're actually developing distributed low-cost sensors that are buried in the soil that sense carbon and carbon flux. So part of this idea is that there's these two types of projects, and the first group of projects that are shown here will serve as real-world demonstration sites for the technologies developed by the second group. So I just summarized the types of R&D that are going on at the U.S. Department of Energy that I believe are relevant to establishing environmental revenue streams for farmers. But before I wrap up, I just wanted to quickly mention a different type of project that is going on in our office. We recently launched this Waste to Energy Technical Assistance Program for our local governments. The goal of this program is to provide data and tools to local government decision makers when they're deciding how to incorporate waste to energy technologies like anaerobic digestion or interesting composting programs in their communities. And so the DOE collects all this data and we develop all these tools, and we were worried that we were really missing an opportunity by not making these tools and data available to local government officials. So the first phase of the program is already launched, and the types of proposals that we received were requests for cost-benefit analyses or resource assessments to help make decisions. So if you're interested in something like that, there will be a phase 2 this summer, and you can get more information at that website, the NREL website. But the reason I bring this up, this Waste to Energy Technical Assistance Program, is that we're considering future additional technical assistance programs that would connect agricultural communities with tools that we've funded in landscape design and carbon management. So the idea here is if landowners are interested in implementing some of these practices, but not sure of the best way to proceed, they could use one of these assistance programs to get technical input from researchers that have studied these issues extensively. They could help provide cost-benefit analysis or make other recommendations. So as we develop future community assistance programs, we'd really like to hear from you, make sure that these are the most useful programs possible. We're also developing our R&D strategy in this area. We anticipate in having workshops and funding opportunities in the near future, and we'd love your input. We want to make sure that these programs are most useful to you and your stakeholders. So the best way to find out about our upcoming workshops and funding opportunities is to subscribe to our newsletter. Just visit our webpage and scroll down to the subscribe to updates page. So with that, thank you so much for your attention and letting me join this webinar. If you have any questions or anything that I can help with, please feel to shoot me an email. And back to you, Julie.
Awesome. Thanks, Nichole. All right, our next presenter is Radhika Moolgavkar, Program Manager of Supply and Methodology from Nori. Radhika leads supply and methodology, at Nori, and is responsible for operationalizing carbon credit supply and developing new methodologies. Prior to Nori, she co-led the battery electric bus program at King County Metro. Radhika?
Thank you very much. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, looks good.
Yes.
All right. So, what is Nori? Nori is a startup that began in 2017, and what we are doing is building a carbon marketplace to help reverse climate change. And so what do? We essentially issue what's called an NRT, and an NRT is simply a Nori carbon removal ton that measures 1 ton of CO2e that's been removed from the atmosphere and sequestered in something for 10 years. And then for each NRT that we issue, we also provide a Nori token, which is a cryptocurrency or technically an NFT. So what we do is sell carbon removals. What we don't do is do reductions or avoidances. We're strictly about removing already existing carbon from the atmosphere. And where do we focus? So we are currently focused in the US on croplands. So we are all about soil organic carbon. And as was mentioned in the previous presentation, what we do is monetize practices that result in additional incremental carbon being stored in the soil. So what does this mean? In this slide, you can see that some farmer who has done old practices like intensive tillage, no cover crops, things like that, this is sort of what their carbon sequestration would look like. This is kind of the background of the carbon. Then at some point, they adopt a new practice that results like no tilling, cover cropping, rotational grazing, all the other things that were mentioned by the former presenter, Nichole, and you all of a sudden see this change in carbon. So this carbon goes up, and this is all due to these new practices. What we do is, let's see, this difference between the two is what we measure and what we quantify into an NRT. And the way that we do it is we use a company called Soil Metrics. Soil Metrics is based on Comet Farm. Comet Farm is a tool that was developed in conjunction with the USDA and Colorado State University, and it's a process-based model that can quantify the amount of carbon stored in the soil. So when we work with farmers, we ask them for a whole bunch of data, 30 years of data. That sounds overwhelming, but we have tools to help them collect that data and tools to help import that data into our system so that they really are more doing a check of what's in there rather than importing the data themselves directly. But we need data that from their tilling practices, from their fertilizer, from their management, cropping management, field by field and year by year. That data is then entered into the Comet Farm tool, and what comes out is this incremental carbon difference. So this is the light blue is the baseline, the gold is the new carbon that's sold, and the difference becomes what is monetized as an NRT. So what I was just talking about is what is our first methodology. It's US crop lines, and it's all about increasing soil and organic carbon with regenerative agriculture practices. And we're using soil metrics, which is the tool that I just mentioned that's based on the Comet Farm USDA approved, Blue Book approved greenhouse gas emission tool. And as I mentioned, we need 30 years of data from farmers, but we have tools within our application that really help minimize the data enrollment impact to farmers. So what do we do and how do we do it? What's kind of the process of getting into the Nori marketplace? So essentially what we do is what I just described first, which is the data collection. We collect historical farm practices, regenerative practices, the date that it switched, enter it all into the Nori application. Once that data is all collected, we run our API into the soil metrics system, and it produces a projection of the number of NRTs that a farmer will generate through their practices. Up until this point, a farmer has not paid anything to Nori or anybody else. It's been a bit of time and effort, but no money has exchanged hands. At this point, the farmer will have a pretty good idea of how much their projections are worth or how much their carbon is worth. Currently in the Nori marketplace, NRTs are selling for $15 an NRT. So they'll have a good idea of how much their project is worth, and they have to make a decision if they want to move forward. Because the next piece of in the process is verification. And for verification, there is a cost associated with it. It's not, this payment doesn't go to Nori, it goes to a third-party entity auditor that is of the supplier's choice, whose job is essentially to audit the project to make sure that the data that's been provided is reliable and replicable, that there's evidence of the agricultural practices, the new agricultural practices, evidence of the switch state, and that if the farmer is not the landowner has given permission for them to participate in this marketplace. The reason we have to do this is that we have to provide buyers some sort of assurance that what they are purchasing is what they think they're purchasing, which is the carbon sequestered in the soil. Once you get through verification, this costs about $3,000 to $5,000 right now. Once a farmer gets through verification, they sign an NRT agreement with Nori that basically allows us to issue the NRTs. And it provides the terms and conditions for the contract or for participating in the Nori marketplace. The contractual term is 10 years. And in those 10 years, the farmer is required to provide data to Nori once a year. And that's really for us to ensure that we understand what's going on with the farm, make sure that there's no weird carbon loss happening. And to be absolutely clear, Nori does not prescribe any practices, nor do they tell the farmer what to do. But if the project is kind of not maybe going sideways, we need to be aware so we can figure out how to work with buyers and the suppliers to kind of right the project. The other thing is we don't use any of the data that's provided to farmers provided by farmers beyond really running the model and improving internal processes. So things like, figuring out different practices that might be better suited for the model, but we never sell the data and we never make it publicly available beyond things that are on the supplier page, like the farmer's name and picture, but that's all with permission from the supplier. Anyway, once the NRT agreement, the other thing I wanted to mention is that every 3 years, when they sign the NRT agreement, the supplier agrees to verify their project every 3 years. So they give data once a year, they verify their project every 3 years. Once the NRT agreement is signed, the NRTs are issued themselves. So, and they are placed on the Nori marketplace. and that's where they are sold. So they're sold on the Nori marketplace. We currently have a first in, first out queue. So it's just literally the first project that's entered into our system. The oldest project entered into our system is the first project that's currently selling. We pay farmers once a month as their NRTs sell. In addition to cash during the Nori pilot phase, which is what we're currently in, we are offering tokens. So I had mentioned tokens earlier. Nori is in the midst of launching these tokens, and they represent one NRT. So one token equals one NRT. And those tokens will be in a restricted 10-year account available to farmers in 10 years. And we kind of think of it as double payment to the farmers that are willing to work with us during the pilot phase, because we anticipate that at some point we'll develop a secondary marketplace where these tokens will be robustly selling and will have, cash value and, similar to other cryptocurrencies, NFTs, assets, and provide the farmer an additional revenue source in 10 years. The farmers that qualify, this is kind of important as you talk to different people, different farmers who are interested in working with Nori. One, they need to have good farm management records because we have that data entry piece. We have worked with farmers who write things down, put things in Excel spreadsheets, or work with farm management platforms. So there's no prescription on how they have to be kept. They just need to be kept in a way that's easy to access and organized. They need to be able to build digital field boundaries for the fields they want to enroll. They have to be US-based croplands, like I mentioned before. They can't be in the Conservation Resource Program in its historical land use program since 2000, and you're willing to pay verification costs. The other additional thing I would say is that right now Nori is a pilot, so you have to also be a person who's willing to spend a little time with us and be patient as we work through these various processes. You also will have needed to adopt a regenerative agriculture practice since 2010, which is kind of this high level at the top of the slide. Unfortunately, we can't work with farmers who have been doing these practices for longer because buyers want new carbon, and so the older carbon just does not sell in this current world. I would say that if you've been doing one practice early, like let's say you were doing no-till before 2010 and you adopted cover cropping post 2010, you would still qualify for a pilot because you don't need to have all your regenerative agriculture practices having started post 2010, just at least one. And you can layer them on. So if you then adopt a new practice in 2016, the model will reflect that even more carbon will be sequestered. So we talked about this a little bit. We do data collection, boundary files, farm records, that kind of stuff. So I'll keep moving. Verifiers. This again was the supplier's choice. I want to highlight that we're currently working with Astra Global, Validus, and SCS. The other thing I wanted to highlight is really, we have found that actually the most difficult part of this is proof that the property owner is allowing the lessee farmer to participate in the marketplace. Can be a complicated conversation, and so it's often kicked down the road, and then when the time comes, it can hold up verification. So we encourage people to have those conversations as early as possible. We talked about the NRT agreement and selling and the issuance process, and so really that kind of concludes the process, my presentation. So if you have any questions, please email hello@nori.com, or I'd be really happy to, answer anything that came up during my presentation. And with that, Julie, I'll turn it back to you. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Radhika. All right, our final presenter is Adam Kiel, Managing Director of the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund and Executive Vice President of AgOutcomes, a subsidiary of the Iowa Soybean Association. In this role, Adam co-administers the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund with Reharvest Partners. He has more than 20 years experience in the field and held a prior role as Director of Conservation for the Iowa Soybean Association. Adam also has held positions with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources and National Park Service. Adam?
All right, thanks, Julie. And you're going to hear some similar themes in my presentation as you've heard in the previous two presentations, but I'll try to highlight some farmer revenue opportunities that are available to those that we work with through the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. So to get started, just a little bit of background about what the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund is and what we do. So we provide financial incentives directly to farmers who implement new conservation practices that produce environmental outcomes. We verify those outcomes, measure those outcomes, and sell them to public and private beneficiaries that see value in those outcomes. You heard about the value of greenhouse gas reductions and soil carbon sequestration. Those are two of our big outcomes that we monetize and sell. We also sell water quality outcomes, which I'll talk about in a moment. But we have a vision of a robust agricultural ecosystem service market that aligns environmental and economic interests from farmers, corporations, governments, and investors. And as I mentioned, we work in kind of the greenhouse gas realm as well as water quality. And what's unique about the offering that we have is that on the same acre, a farmer can sell both the carbon sequestration value of the conservation that's implemented as well as the water quality benefits. And those are sold to different parties. We'll go through a transaction diagram here in a second, but I just want to mention that because it's fairly unique in the carbon space in the sense that we're monetizing multiple environmental outcomes. Just a little bit of a deeper dive into our greenhouse gas side of the operation and our target audience there. So we do produce soil carbon sequestration and nitrous oxide reductions. Those are sold to customers through a business-to-business agreement that we have. So when farmers work with us, we have a guaranteed buyer of their environmental outcomes before they implement the practices in the field. Oftentimes our customers are looking to achieve science-based targets that they've set or achieve some sort of corporate sustainability reduction related to climate change. So that's kind of our typical carbon or GHG customer. On the water side, we work both in a regulatory way and a voluntary way. So we work with water quality entities who have permits and PDS permits, wastewater plants specifically, and help them produce lower cost nitrogen and phosphorus reductions by working on upstream farms. What we're really trying to do here with both the greenhouse gas side of our operation as well as water is switch from what has traditionally been a government funded paid for practice approach where a farmer would get paid for, say, an acre of cover crops to a pay for outcomes approach where a farmer is paid, a farmer's payment is calibrated to the environmental outcomes they produce. We are really trying to flip that switch because we think the technology is available now to get a pretty good estimate of the climate benefits as well as the water quality benefits and structure a transaction around those outcomes rather than paying for the practice and hoping that the outcomes come along. So a little bit of a deep dive into our operation, and you're going to hear obviously some similarities between what we do and Nori, but I'll try to highlight maybe some differences. So how we operate, we really want to take on the risk of producing environmental outcomes and put that on us, on the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. So at the end of the day, at the end of the transaction diagram here, our outcome customers are purchasing something that has been implemented by farmers and measured, quantified, and aggregated so that they know that they are purchasing something that has value to them. So the first step in the process is farmers proposing conservation practices that they add to their farming operations. And the key difference here from how we operate is we require farmers to implement new conservation practices as they enroll. So we are not purchasing environmental outcomes from previous conservation practice implementation. This does draw the ire of farmers from time to time because we're not able to pay for reduced tillage that maybe occurred 10 years ago or even 2 years ago. We do strive to produce outcomes that are the direct result of an intervention that we had at any given point in time. So this year's outcomes are the result of additional conservation practices that farmers are implementing this year. Farmers present to us their baseline operational data. Anytime they would enter the field with a piece of equipment, we ask for information about that. We also ask for what they're proposing to change to. So the baseline and the proposed scenario, and we take that data and run it through two models. The previous presenter mentioned Comet Farm. We also use Comet Farm for our greenhouse gas accounting, and we use the nutrient tracking tool model to estimate the water quality benefits that are generated by those same conservation practices. At that time, we present farmers with a customized payment that is calibrated to the outcomes they are producing. We pay farmers up to $40 an acre for environmental outcomes, and we've got contracts that range anywhere between $5 and $40 an acre. Farmers are used to dealing with varying production in their grain crops. They understand that the more corn you produce in a given acre, the more potential there is for revenue. The same concept applies here. The more environmental outcomes they produce per acre, the more potential payment there is. So farmers enter into a contract with us. When they sign that contract, we pay them half of that contract value at the point of signing. This gives them some working capital to implement conservation practices and do the steps that they need to do to get conservation on the ground. We then work with them throughout the growing season and over the course of the year to do in-field monitoring and verification. We also utilize remote sensing to verify practice implementation is occurring per the contract specifications. At the end, we then work with the farmers that we've entered into contracts with to aggregate those outcomes and transact with our customers. Our current customer pool includes a mix of public and private entities. Our carbon customers, our greenhouse gas customers, tend to be more corporate in nature, whereas our water quality customers tend to be a mix of local governments, state governments, all the way up to USDA purchasing water quality outcomes from us. So a little bit about how we're different. I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for questions for everybody, but go through this rather quickly. Hopefully understand that we're trying to flip the switch here on not paying for practices, but paying farmers for the outcomes they produce. We also strive to stack outcomes together, both for the farmers so that they can achieve higher revenue opportunities, but also work with our beneficiaries and stacking beneficiaries together. We also customize the program design, so we work where our customers want to work, whether that's priority supply sheds or priority watersheds for our water customers, and we try to find the Venn between both of our customer pools. And we talked about additionality. That's a key word in this space. Look to implement new conservation practices that have benefits occurring at the time of the practice implementation. So again, we're not selling these environmental outcomes that have resulted from past practice implementation. So where do we currently operate? We're currently in Midwestern states in Iowa, Illinois, and Ohio, soon to be expanding to Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, Kansas, and other states. But we work currently across 100,000 acres. We're not taking all farmers at the moment because we don't want to commit farmers to a contract where we don't have a committed buyer. So when a farmer enters into our program, we have someone already in line who is willing to purchase their environmental outcomes they produce. So it's a guaranteed purchase so long as they follow that the contract that they've signed with us. I mentioned the farmer payment is up to $40 per acre, and that's calibrated to the scale of outcomes they produce. Our specific customers on the carbon or the greenhouse gas side, Cargill, Nutrient Ag Solutions, PepsiCo, and Ingredion are customers that we've publicly announced, and those customers of ours are purchasing across the states shown on the map. Our water quality customers, as I mentioned, include the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, a couple municipalities, and other local governments in the states that we operate. And there's various reasons for those customers to purchase water quality outcomes from us, but at the end of the day, because we are stacking together carbon and water quality outcomes together in a single transaction, we can lower the cost for both of our customer pools. And actually, we've done financial analysis of our water quality customers and have shown that we can deliver lower cost nitrogen and phosphorus reductions than some of the state-run or federally run conservation programs that strive to improve water quality in the Mississippi River Basin. So again, we're trying to flip things on its head a bit here, where we're paying for outcomes and structuring a transaction around that, connecting farmers with downstream customers of both the climate benefits that they produce and the water quality benefits. We are always looking for new partnerships with public and private entities to help expand our pool of purchasing power on farms. And we hope that we can continue to grow and engage with more farmers in this sustainability journey in new states and in new regions and in future years. If you'd like to find out more information about the Outcomes Fund, you can visit our website, www.theoutcomesfund.com, or feel free to reach out to me directly. Happy to have a conversation about the work that we do. I think there's plenty of opportunity to bring this type of work, and I'll throw Nori in this as well. I think there's other opportunities that are currently untapped for accessing carbon offsets from agriculture. And, you know, I think we're at the kind of tip of the iceberg in dealing with some of the corporate partners that want to purchase outcomes. There's high potential that federal government will step in and purchase outcomes from farmers. But there's also opportunities to link in renewable fuels, low carbon fuel standards, and other ways that we can link up farmers producing environmental outcomes with those that desire the benefits. So I'll stop my share and we'll leave it there for any questions or comments that the attendees have. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Adam. So as Adam said, now we're going to open it up for questions, and I would actually like to start one off for the panelists. So in your opinion, you know, this is a group of state energy offices. So how can state energy offices and state governments support these markets and make the connections between agricultural and energy environmental goals?
Well, I'll start. I think there are a few ways that the offices can help. I think one of the biggest pieces missing is really good on the ground education about these marketplaces. It's confusing. There are many out there. What does it mean? I think there's, to Adam's point, there is room for many different types of programs, but helping farmers navigate what makes sense for them and what makes, you know, what's the best program for them would be a huge help. I think there's also helping them and educating farmers on how to move over to regenerative agriculture practices, maybe even grants and other programs of that type that help with the initial cost of transitioning would also be beneficial. And the final thing I've been thinking a lot about is how you loop in the universities who are training the next generation of farmers and work with them to make sure that they understand and can work in this field as soon as possible. So that's why.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I would add that there's probably opportunities to position state governments in these markets as well. I know that there are some states that have set goals similar to, you know, or that align with the Paris Accord. So I think there are opportunities for state governments to enter into markets as a purchaser of some of these outcomes that could help them offset some state goals, or at least achieve state goals. So that's a kind of a different twist on the earlier response.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to Radhika and Adam's response, but yeah, definitely providing help in navigating the multitude of opportunities. I know that I have trouble navigating all the different opportunities that are here, so I'm sure that folks in the agricultural sector are also struggling for what is the best opportunity for them. And that's part of the reason that we're interested in starting this technical assistance program, to put maybe farm communities in touch with our lab researchers or our academic groups to help navigate these choices.
Great, thanks. And for any of our attendees, feel free to type your message in, or you might be able to also raise your hand and ask live. Dylan, I don't know if that's a feature that they can take advantage of or not. Or if
Yeah, anybody can raise their hand and then I can unmute you to ask your question. I was wondering if you'd seen any impact on kind of the agricultural yields that these farmers are producing, and if the enhanced kind of monitoring that's required as part of these programs have helped farming practices more generally.
Yeah, just some feedback. One thing that I didn't mention that maybe was inherent in the bio, but my bosses are farmers. You know, we're a subsidiary of the Iowa Soybean Association, so I have to you know, ultimately report to farmers in Iowa. To that end, just some commentary on the current carbon marketplace. Radhika mentioned the value of carbon being around $15 per ton. Through our program, we estimate that the average production, if farmers switch to a no-till and cover crop scenario on their farms, can generate somewhere between half a ton and 3/4 of a ton. So you start working the economics, you're looking at you know, $7.50, maybe upwards up to $10 per acre, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. Frankly, that doesn't cover the cost of cover crop seed. So we need to think about ways that we can generate additional value for carbon. Personally, I think the current carbon price of $15 a ton is a little bit low. We've been able to make it work because we're bringing in the value of the other ecosystem services that the farmer generates through those same practices, and get them up to that point where they are realizing a payment that at least covers the cost of the operational changes that they're making. So kind of a long-winded answer, but just kind of meandering around the point that it's good where we're at, but there's opportunities to grow to help this be at least an offset for farmers in terms of what the costs are to make some of these changes that we're asking for.
Great.
I would just say that I completely agree with everything Adam said, particularly that the cost of carbon is too low. And that's one of the things we hope that the Nori token will help drive, is the price discovery around carbon, and, you know, really show what its true value is versus what is sort of a speculative, very low value.
There's a question in the Q&A from David that I can address rather than try to type it out and manage this at the same time. So I think the question is around variability in weather and how that impacts performance of practices. I don't want to speak for Radhika, but you know, we all experience the same variability in our forecasting of what the carbon or water quality production looks like. The way that we do it through our COMET model is kind of look at climate history, climate forecasts, and build that variability of weather into the model. So it's not assuming an average. There is some year-to-year variability in the model, and then we utilize a 10-year average within COMET to come up with that estimate about what the carbon benefits are. So we are accounting for that weather variability through our models. And there's other ways that we also manage risk that are pretty inherent in most carbon and ecosystem service markets, where not all of the outcomes are sold. And there's other buffer pools that groups have in place. But yeah, that's addressed a couple different ways, one through the model and then also through the pricing and the transaction of the actual outcomes.
And I did have one question. I guess this applies to actually all three of you panelists. Is what's the primary method that you and how you connect with farmers to let them know about whatever product or research or service that you're providing? Is it through like listservs and mailings or advertisements or door to door? Like, what's your preferred method and what have you found works best?
Our best method is building good relationships with farmers and then word of mouth from there. So being that we don't work everywhere, we want to build strong relationships with, frankly, down to the neighborhood level of farmers that work together. Farming is probably one of the most highly relationship businesses there is. So establishing good relationships with farmers will lead to more farmers hearing good things about the program, and then hopefully increasing enrollment. So that's relationship development all the way down to the farm level is a key recruitment activity that we take pride in.
Yeah, from the U.S. Department of Energy standpoint, like Adam, we definitely believe that these individual relationships are probably the most important thing to cultivate. But, being part of a federal bureaucracy, we are probably the least agile of the other two groups here. And so we definitely rely a lot on listservs. The best way that we gather information about how we're going to move forward with any of our initiatives is through these workshops that we hold. We hold them at least once a year. And that's the best way to get that input so that we can make sure that we're addressing the needs of the farm community.
So I echo what Adam said and what we've all said, right? Farming is highly relationship based. We do that. But the other thing that Nori has is we also have a podcast. So we have sort of another way of reaching people that sometimes strangely brings farmers into our universe. We have some really good relationships with larger groups who work in agriculture. And then one thing I didn't touch upon, but because we're so small and a startup, we can't work individually with every farmer who has wanted to work with us. So we've created what we call a data manager role, and that is not a Nori position, but it's people within the farming community who want to help farmers enroll into the Nori marketplace. And it can be either software platforms or actual individuals. And we are working with that group to do additional reach out to farmers because who knows them better than their neighbors. And so that's how we've also approached working with farmers.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. And I don't see anything else in the Q&A, but I have another question. I think I'm remembering on both of the kind of graphics on how the payment structure and business model works. The first step is the farmer kind of presenting a plan on how they will change their practices in order to just do it and deliver the environmental outcome. So I was just wondering if there's any resources you have on like what that would actually take from a farmer, or like what it would look like if they're considering it, like how actually different the practice would need to be or their operations would need to change to account for this type of thing.
So I'll say we do actually do a backwards look. I didn't go into that in a ton of detail, but what we really need is a switch state into one of these regenerative agriculture practices no earlier than 2010, and then we will model what that has done, and so we will compare what would have been under the old practices with what will be under the new practice. We don't have great resources right now about what works best. We are tracking that, but don't have anything too earth-shattering to report, but typically, you know, reducing no-till has a huge impact. Manure has a good impact. Deeper rooted crops, sort of very intuitive stuff tends to be what we see making the largest and most monetary maybe benefit for a farmer from a carbon removal perspective strictly.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, you know, our target demographic is a farmer who's done no-till and cover crops and fertilizer management on potentially small scale or small percentage of their operation. They're looking at how to scale up to their entire operation. Those are the ideal candidates for our fund. So we're not looking necessarily for the person who has zero experience with conservation practices. We're looking for that person that's got some experience but are willing to take that next step to go to their entire operation. Typically, government-funded cost share programs only work on a limited number of acres. So we're a good filler for going from, say, 100 acres up to 500 or even more. So there's not, I would say there's not a huge learning curve. There's good familiarity with these practices in the farm community now. Just may not have the scale that we all want, but hopefully through programs like ours, we're able to motivate farmers to scale up.
Great, thank you. And Adam, I noticed that the group's only operating in a couple states now. Were there any kind of barriers you needed to get over to start operating in new states as this market grows?
Yeah, so it may have been glossed over a little bit, but we only operate where we have committed customers. So we're not producing speculative outcomes and then hoping to find a customer for those outcomes after they're produced. We really want to line up both a water quality customer and a greenhouse gas customer before we engage with a farmer. Don't want to get crossways with a farmer. That's the fastest way to ruin your reputation. So we really want to make sure that we have our ducks in a row before we work with any farmer.
Makes sense. Okay. Thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat. I just want to pause for a second to see if any last minute things come up. But otherwise, thank you so much to our panelists for joining. I really appreciate your time and taking the time to create a presentation for us and share it with our members. And thanks to Julie for moderating. And I'm not seeing any final questions, so it looks like we can end a minute or so early. But thanks again, everybody, for joining. Hopefully we'll be doing more things like this with the NASEO's Rural Task Force. So thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dylan. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.